Let's go. Hello, and welcome back to the Less is More Education podcast with your host, Steve Flores. This is episode 20 with my special guest, State Senator Josh Newman. All right, thank you very much, Senator Newman. Thank you for talking to me and spending some time with me today.
Glad to be here, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and so the whole idea behind the podcast is to hear your experiences with education, and we're going to start off with what kind of a student were you in, like, let's say, elementary school through high school through college?
Okay. What kind of a student was I? So I think it's worth noting, I had a bunch of different kind of schooling experiences. So I went from kind of a very liberal kind of experimental private school from kindergarten through fourth grade, then classic kind of public school in my hometown of Poughkeepsie, New York, from fifth through ninth. I guess that's three schools: elementary, middle school, then a year of high school. Then I went to private prep school from 10th through 12th grade. So I had kind of an array of experiences. And so through that, what kind of a student was I? Well, from kindergarten through fourth grade, it was one of these kind of experimental, I'm old, it was during the 70s where they were trying different models of education. So went to a school where the emphasis was on kind of unstructured learning and lack of borders and barriers. So it was a school that the thing I remember the most, we had, not only did we not have doors on the classrooms, because doors were considered constricting, we didn't have chairs. So wow. all the students referred to their teachers by their first names. I didn't even know the last names of my teachers. And no chairs, because chairs were thought to be very conventional.
Yeah.
And so they had these big blocks everywhere. So if you wanted to set yourself up to learn, you'd get some blocks and create a little learning pod, where you'd learn. And again, really unstructured, right? So basically, no curriculum per se. They'd find out what's a kid interested in, go do it, right? And so the things I remember was I did these math workbooks, where in like second grade I was allegedly up to like seventh grade math, which probably wasn't true.
Wow.
Just done a lot of these workbooks, and then writing, like a lot of creative writing. And one of the things I remember most is like keeping a journal about the gerbil that was in the corner of the room, and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if I was a good student or bad student, because it was all good.
Yeah.
And then I went in fifth grade. I don't know why. My parents switched us to public school, and so I went to sort of your typical urban small city public school. And I remember being super aware of two things. One, that it was so structured, right? You had all the different we had the same teacher all day, Mr. Lee, good guy. But all every class, sort of the class periods. We never had that in my private school. And then I had this kind of hyper awareness that I was different, right? Because I'd come from this kind of weird hippie school. And so, the things like spelling bees, we didn't have that, the Poughkeepsie Day School, social studies. And I think I did well, right? I did, for whatever reason, I think I'm good at a certain kind of testing or, problem solving. So in public school, I got great grades. So I went to the Governor George C. Clinton Elementary School, the Poughkeepsie Middle School, 6th through 8th grades, 9th grade Poughkeepsie High School. And I think I was a good student, which is to say I got good grades. And then I went to a private boarding school from 10th through 12th grades. It did well enough. The difference there was in public school we got a number grade, and that all seemed very easy to me. You can always figure out like trying to get 100 on every test, what was your average. Then went to a school where not only did we have letter grades, but the thing that probably hurt me, we got effort grades too. Oh. and I was probably a good enough student at that time where the letter grade wasn't hard, but I got caught out a lot on the effort grade.
Oh,
so
yeah.
you'd get a report card and you'd get A minus, A whatever, and then you'd get the effort grade was a number, right? And I think 5 was good effort and 1 was terrible, and I was getting 3s, and so that was the conversation at my house, and so my parents really did value education. My dad was a physician, small town doctor. My mom did a bunch of things, including she actually ran for the school board.
Very
when
cool.
When I was in 7th grade, and she got elected. So that made for an interesting kind of vibe, where my mom was by then, I think 8th, 9th grade, was the president of our school board, even as she was about to send her kid to private school. So, the school at the time had massive financial challenges. I assume most of it wasn't my mom's fault.
Okay, yeah.
But I think that sort of instigated the thinking of saying my sister and I to private school for those last couple of years. So I'm always aware that, my experience probably isn't typical. A certain kind of grade learning came pretty easy to me, but everybody learns differently.
Yeah.
And so how you learn individually is very different than how we do education systemically.
Yeah. Like, what do you think those earlier experiences, how much do you think they set you up for later experiences in terms of teaching you like the value of like motivating yourself? Or because it seems to me like if you're in an experimental school like that and you sit down and you start doing like math workbooks, that's got to be coming from somewhere within you as opposed to like from the outside coming in.
I'll bet it has a big impact, right? So I'll bet it had a very big impact on how I sort of go about learning, and how you gravitate toward the things that you want to learn about, as opposed to the more kind of passive approach, where kids say, first hour you do this, second hour you do that. But I don't, I don't have a twin brother who did the opposite.
Yeah, right.
It's hard to compare.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because when I hear a lot of interviews or when I talk to people that seem to get higher up in whatever trade or path that they've gone through, I hear a lot of those similar stories of being given a lot of autonomy at a young age.
Right.
And that seems to be a common theme that I
maybe so. And so I remember this thing that it always sticks with me that that you were as a kid they're like go do learn, and I remember I think it was third grade where we had some assignment where you had to put up your third grade, right, you're like 8, your resolution for the year, like the thing you want to work on, right? I don't know why. And so I wrote it, and I couldn't understand why adults thought it was so funny. But my thing was, in the next year, I'm going to try not to be such a perfectionist, right? And so when you're 8, you're like, why is that funny, right? And then when you're adult, you're like, that's funny, right? 8-year-old thinking he's a perfectionist.
Yeah.
And I remember then I went from our weird little private school to public school, and I remember my mom was really interested in what are you learning, how are you learning, how's the teacher doing it, and she kind of introduced herself to Mr. Lee. And at one point, I think in the fall, she said, I don't think Josh is being challenged enough, right? And so she asked him to give me extra work, right? Give him extra work, make sure that he's not coasting. And all my classmates thought that I was limited, right? That I was getting remedial. Like, what's wrong with you? Right?
Yeah.
Like, why are you so far behind? I was like, I don't think I'm behind, right? And I got all kind of nervous about it. But the difference probably, that I was telling you, it's about your parents, right? In many cases, it's about how your family thinks about education, how your family goes at learning. Yeah. And in my house, it was obviously an important thing. Not just grades probably mattered, I guess. Actually, they didn't. I don't remember my parents actually worried about my grades. It was about learning, right? About being a good learner, an active, curious learner.
Yeah. And do you feel like you readily were accepting of those, I guess, skills that your parents were trying to teach you of like, okay, the focus should be on the learning as opposed to, like getting grades?
Maybe, but only because I think the grades for me, right, came fairly easly, right? Especially in public school. And I remember in 7th, 8th grade, 6th grade, you were in one class, and 7th, 8th grade, you switched classes. Bunch of friends, taking different classes together, and it somehow became my job to help other kids cheat off me, right? In public school, right? And in a couple of courses, so I remember I used to study really hard because I didn't want to give the wrong answers to Billy or Brian, and if you look back and think, well, maybe that wasn't so great.
Yeah.
But I think at that time that was the understanding in our peer groups, go get the answers from Josh.
Yeah.
Right. And I guess I was kind of flattered. I never really thought about the ethics of it.
Yeah, I remember a lot. I had a lot of similar experiences growing up. Yeah. I get it. Yeah. Yeah, and there's a lot of pressure, I guess, to try and feel accepted, and so you're or not even just feeling accepted, but oh, I have a valuable role.
Totally. And I will say, I'm average height, I'm 5'9" now, but I was a little dude. Right? I was a little kid. I was smaller than my peers. Right? I was a little guy in the class. And I remember in 6th grade, there was a girl I sat next to, Melissa, and she used to always come up to me and say, I had big ears too, and she'd come up to me and say, hi, Mickey. And I was probably the shortest kid in my class. And so probably, you're probably trying to earn your peer group's approval, however you do it. And if your thing was like, that kid's got all the answers, okay.
I'll lean into it. Yeah.
That's my, that's my value.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very cool.
Would I give you the answers on a test today? No, I wouldn't.
Yeah.
I wouldn't. I wouldn't.
Yeah. Let's hope so. All right. How were you how was your college experience?
So I had a wonderful college experience. I went to Yale University, and I was a history major. It's a liberal arts university. It obviously has a decent reputation. So it was. I applied early action. I got in. It was. I didn't apply anywhere else. I thought that place good enough for me.
Wow.
And clearly good enough for my parents. My dad thought it was a cool place. He used to go to medical meetings in New Haven, where Yale's located. So he had this idea. Yale students were so smart.
Yeah.
And so I was a little, I think, daunted, like everybody is, about how do you choose and all the. So I got in. I was like, that's great. Probably as good as lots of places. And so I had a terrific experience. And so I don't know. Academically, I certainly wasn't like an overachiever. Didn't underachieve either. So you got a BA in history. But across 4 years, had just a wonderful time, and one of the gifts you get by going to a really good school like that is, and you don't realize until later in life, is just to be immersed with smart people, who are equally kind of engaged in learning and kind of learning about the world, learning about themselves, with smart faculty members to kind of assist you doing that. It was just a wonderful privilege to be able to do that. Didn't realize it at the time because I was just a kid.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Wow. There's a lot to be said about that. Especially like having like a culture of learning around you where everybody's just trying to be their best. And that's very interesting when I think about my own teaching experience, because I taught public school for 12 years. So from 2010 to like fairly recently to 2022 was my final year of teaching. And I was seeing some of the opposite going on at the high school level, where there wasn't a culture of like education or learning. And I was struggling through that, because I was like, all right, well, how much of that is the culture of the school itself, or how much of that is this culture of like the population that we happen to have?
Right, and then the other input is obviously the kind of culture or attitude, sort of values of the family, right? Of the family that shapes you, and so those three things interact in really interesting ways.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So another question I had for you, thinking back about your educational experience, were there times or a specific time where you felt like learning came so like naturally to you, where it just felt almost like effortless? So
I think by circumstance, those first 4 years of school in that kind of unstructured private school environment that I had. And again, I don't think it was a fancy school, but it was this kind of 70s kind of experimental model. I think learning, it must have felt easy because there weren't any pressures, right? I have a first grader now. My daughter's 6, and they're already getting homework and gets checked off. I don't remember any of that. So all the learning I did, I probably felt super effortless because it was pure. Right? It was unmoderated, ungraded. It was just what you wanted to learn, and I couldn't tell you what my classmates learned. I couldn't even tell you how they turned out, for that matter. But so probably then, and then I'll say later, kind of interestingly, after college, I joined the military, and I went to officer candidate school, and then there's another course after that once you get commissioned to the officer basic course, and it's a lot of school, right? And officer candidate school was about school. You had to take courses at the U.S. Army Infantry course at Fort Benning, Georgia. But boy, that was really just to kind of put your mind to rest, to see who had the character or somebody to be an officer. And I remember that learning came very easy, and we were learning about kind of military stuff. But it was interesting because it was super structured, as you expect. But you got a grade every day. You got evaluated every day. Your average was posted every day, and so it made for an interesting context because you were rated against your classmates every day. And I found I was pleasantly surprised that kind of learning came pretty easily to me. I mean, lots of other things weren't as easy in the military, but to absorb information and then take those military standardized tests, I did well, and that was probably because of, I don't know, it's sort of past training and everything's relative. But it was.
Did you notice any patterns between people that were being successful in the officer candidate school or in people that weren't?
Yeah. I mean, it was about. I think there were differences where people came from, right? And so at OCS, there's two types of candidate. One was guys like me who came out of college, had a degree, and then had to meet a bunch of requirements to then get accepted. And then the question is, do you have what it takes? And the other cohort was people who'd been in the military, who'd gotten their education in the military, but prior service, as they call them, who were then sort of designated as kind of good enough to go kind of take that course. And for them, the academics were probably much harder, right? And again, there's academics as kind of a test to fill your time to see. I mean, it was really just a big hazing experiment to see, like, who had the character to be an officer in the military.
Yeah.
And so I found the educational stuff really easy. The other stuff, I got caught laughing a lot, that kind of thing. So it wasn't necessarily as stress-free.
Yeah. Very cool. This is very interesting that you would talk about that time. There's actually a school that's it's been around since the 80s that takes that model that you grew up with and just applies it all the way through high school, which is the Sudbury Valley High School. And that's located in, I think it's Framingham, Massachusetts. Yeah. And so they take that same structure or the same setup all the way through high school. So they don't have a curriculum. There's no the teachers, it's very democratic. So like the teachers get elected every year by the students and staff. So everyone has an equal vote essentially, which is really interesting to hear. Yeah. Where if you aren't succeeding as a teacher or your students don't feel like you are, they can literally vote you out, and then bring in another candidate to see if they can have it. Because since everyone's vote matches the same and staff is only 15% of the population of the school, it's mainly the students deciding, all right, these are...
Wow. So what teacher gets voted out? What is that teacher, where do they go?
That's a good question. I don't know. Yeah. But I as a part of my research, I came across that school and I was like, oh, this sounds very familiar.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. And again, for us, I mean, you're 5, 6, 7. And so it's your parents making those decisions that put you in those structures, and so we didn't really question. You don't question until you look back and you realize wow, that was different, right? And there's that question, to what extent did that shape me, to the positive or otherwise, right? As a student, or would I have been the same? And I do think that sort of unstructured, go do whatever. It's probably a good thing, right? In moderation, right at that time, but like I said, had I gone to conventional public school, who knows how I would have turned out? I don't know.
Yeah. So I have this theory that it seems to me when there is a lot of time where learning feels effortless, that there are 3 conditions for it, and they also kind of correspond with having just meaningful work in general. And that's A is a sense of autonomy, right? Feeling like you have choices, feeling like you can make your own decisions, and your decisions actually have an effect on whatever it is that you're working on. B is going to be competency. So no matter what task you're being given or you're taking on for yourself, it's always either at your level or even better, just outside of your level, so that you're constantly reaching. Right. And then 3 or C is this relatedness, right? So that is more interpersonal connections with the other people that are working immediately around you, having a shared goal. This is why when I heard you speaking about Yale, I found that really interesting of we're in a culture of learning. Everyone here has the same basic goal in mind. Yeah. And that seems to be really helpful when it comes to learning effortlessly or doing meaningful work. Would you say in your officer candidate school and when you were also younger in that Poughkeepsie experience, those 3 values were kind of coming through, or?
I would say that sort of describes it well. I think, and again, like if you're the doer, right, you're probably not like consciously aware of any of this stuff, and that's why I think a lot of these things become clear in retrospect, right? Like college being an example. Like there's that saying, like youth is only wasted on the young, right? So you don't know it until you go out into the world and you think, wow, how lucky was I, and how different the world is when you consider, like, we were so lucky to be just in a community of people that were actively engaged in learning and figuring out who they were.
Yeah.
And that's a blessing, right? Most environments, most of the sort of situations you find yourself in don't allow that. Mm-hmm. And so to have that for some point in your life, especially in those kind of developmentally critical times, is probably great. Mm-hmm. It's probably very good. And I think as a public servant now, I think that really does inform a lot of the way I think about things.
Yeah. All right. Very cool. So that kind of leads me into, I'm going to skip a question here, but into you mentioned that a lot of places do not allow for that, right? They do not allow for a lot of like choice, like those those three values, right? Autonomy, mm-hmm. competency, and relatedness. Like, do you feel like the California education system, particularly like K through 12, because that's the area that I'm focusing on, mm-hmm. allows for those kinds of experiences?
So that's a good question. So the thing that I'm always kind of confronted by as a legislator, right, as a participant in policy discussions in Sacramento, in a state that is as big and diverse as California, is it's really hard to sort of superimpose systems on a state this big that account for local differences, that would incorporate, for instance, that model, right? The autonomy, relatedness, competency, and so we aspire to do that, but it's hard. It's hard to do mm-hmm. if the emphasis is on budgets, class size, solving for certain kind of fiscal challenges year to year, and so I actually this morning, right, I dropped my kid off, and every other week my wife signed me up to be the classroom volunteer. She thinks that keeps me grounded, and I always try to think of reasons why I can't do it, right? Today I went in, and so it's always interesting to see my little kid's elementary school, and they had a substitute teacher today. Mrs. Campbell was out. And so I was in the back. I had to organize the homework that just got turned in. That's my thing on Fridays. But it's interesting to watch, 32 kids in this class, which is a pretty big class.
Yeah.
And to see these little people, all kind of, moving around, and to see now the substitute teacher trying to, collect and organize them. And then you get a sense, if you've done this for a little while, at the differences between kids, right? And so I think my kid is smack dab in the middle, from what I can tell. She's not nothing special, but she's socially kind of aware, and she seems.
Yeah.
I mean, she's certainly not like a prodigy in any ways. But it's interesting to watch all the kids interact, and you have to account for all of those differences. All those little people coming from different places, different family cultures, from different demographies, different backgrounds. That's a really hard thing onto which to impose. These more kind of didactic models, right? That try to encourage certain things, and it's a lot of it depends on the teacher, I suppose, but a lot of it is really challenging when you consider the largeness, the complexity of these structures.
Yeah. I mean, there's a reason why my podcast is called Less is More, mm-hmm. Education. And from what I've seen, because I do a lot of research on like international school systems, so I look at places like Canada, Australia, Finland, Singapore, China to a little bit of because these are the locations where they tend to have high international scores. So mm-hmm. you look at PISA scores, which are like these international tests that are given to all these countries, and and they always score up at the top. And they also have very high equity, meaning the effect of socioeconomic status is very low. Right, so if you are wealthier or not, they tend to score around the same amount. And they do. One of the things that I found was that they also have like this structure that allows for a lot of automaticity, a lot of competency, and a lot of relatedness that's being generated by the stakeholders themselves. So the state just is only responsible for setting up like, all right, here are the standards, and that's all we're gonna do, right? Is we're just gonna set the standards. This is what we want to see, right? And it's not a huge detailed document. It's like a small like framework that's maybe 50 pages that covers all of K through 12 education.
Right.
And then what they do is they just give the rest to local districts and go like, all right, how you're going to implement this is really just going to be up to you. And the way they kind of like ensure quality is they set up their teachers for success, right? So as an example, in all of these locales, becoming a teacher is just as difficult as like becoming an engineer, right? So for example, Finland, it's a 5-year process where you get your undergrad and your master's, and it's very exclusive, right? I think only about 20% of the applicants get in, and then that's limited by the state because the state just looks at all the schools and says, all right, how many teachers do we have? They get a number, they send that over to the universities. The universities go like, all right, we're just gonna invest in this amount of teachers, nothing more. So we gotta make sure that they're of high quality. So what we're gonna do is we're going to set the bar really high to getting in, and then we're gonna set their pay to being equivalent to other professionals with the same degree.
Yeah.
Right. So in places like Singapore, they tie teacher salaries to the salaries of engineers and accountants. So engineers, accountants, and teachers all make the same amount, and then that scales with experience and education and all that. But it's very like simplified version of education or idea of education. It's like, all right, we're gonna focus on these teachers. We're gonna make sure the standards are really high for them. We're going to pay them like other professionals. We're gonna set the standards, and then we're just gonna let it go, right? And then what you actually start to see is by simplifying the system, you start to see like greater results because each individual now has like almost like a culture, like you said, right? It was very hard to become a teacher. So every teacher that gets put into the system now is a very high standard and now is in a group with other teachers that are also holding themselves to a high standard. And then that's what tends to lift these education systems up, and then you see it in their test scores, and you see it on other markers, like in Finland. Like Finland's like the happiest country.
Yeah.
Right. And
But Finland's also a very wealthy country. Right?
It's true. Yeah.
Finland can afford, or has made the decision to prioritize education, where we obviously approach it very differently. And there's that question of equity, right? So we think about equity in probably a very different way. And to the extent, so I had a meeting recently with a superintendent of a district in my area, and she was kind of advocating for something similar to what you're describing. She said, just give us money, give us a block of money, then hold us accountable, right? And we'll go figure it out. And if we don't, kick us out, change things. But California, because it's so big, we've taken a very kind of programmatic approach, and often it's justified in terms of equity, which says we want to decrease the likelihood that any one group gets less.
Yeah.
Right. And so when you do that, you wind up with something that's way less flexible, but it seems on some level equitable by definition. But it does not allow for innovation. It doesn't allow for a lot of creativity. And then there's that larger question, like within that, what level of kind of respect, prestige do we give to teaching? And in so doing, how do we get the best people? But probably just importantly, how do we advance their learning, their development as teachers? One of the big problems in school, despite it being so busy, is we don't really give teachers much time to share information or to develop themselves after they've started teaching.
Yes, yeah, that's very true. Yeah. When you look at other systems, like the ones I mentioned before, that's all in the school day, right? So the average American teacher is in front of the students 27 hours a week, right? The OECD average, that's the average of economically cooperating countries, is 19 hours. So it's already vastly different. And you look at Singapore, Singapore's number one in test scores. Their teachers are in front of students 17 hours a week, right? Which is even less, which is really ironic because, it's like the less time you put teachers in front of students, like the greater the results you're starting to see,
right.
Which is really counterintuitive,
Right.
It doesn't make, logically, it's hard to comprehend, what's going on there.
Right, and then there's that question about who's in front of the students during those times where teachers are, cooperating on learning and sharing information, and so and so we're very prescriptive in California with respect to curriculum, probably overly prescriptive. And to your point, there's that question about you can lose sight, I think, of the broader goals, right, or the imperative to innovate, and a reality of school, right, especially from K through fifth grade, is it's sort of it's also daycare, right? It's also childcare, I guess, a better way to put it.
Yeah.
And so we sort of toggle between learning, right? What is it we're trying to teach kids, and we can test certain things, versus just it's a place where we're expected to have resources from 2:30, right? And so for my part, right, there's this broader question what is the thing we're trying to do with education?
Yes. Yeah. And so that's one of the questions that I'm glad you asked or you said that, because that's one of the questions that I had for you was, when I go look at the SBE website, so school board, State Board of Education website, and I look at the CDE website, California Department of Education website, and I try to find what's the purpose of education. The closest thing I can get is it's to educate students, right, which is a very nebulous term.
Well, that's tautological, as they would say, right? The purpose of education is to educate.
Yeah, and then
it's not saying much.
Yeah, and then the state board or the school State Board of Education, whoever's running the State Board of Education sets up their own agenda, and then because that person changes from time to time, it almost seems like the state goes in this direction, then it goes in this direction, then it goes in this direction. There's no guiding light that can kind of unify all of education. So I think one of the most important things that might help our education system is setting up a unifying purpose for education, right?
Yeah.
So I've spoken to quite a few people and academics as well as teachers, and I thought to myself, all right, what would be the optimal purpose that we could set up for the state, so that no matter who comes in, we can always go all right, we need to do this, and it has to be actionable, and it has to be clear, and everyone has to agree upon it. So I'm proposing something, and I'm not saying that it's correct. There's probably room for improvement, right? And I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. The purpose of education is to holistically develop young people to realize their passions and take the lead in their own lives, so that they may take responsibility for themselves and contribute to society.
I couldn't argue with any of that. And so, another way to phrase that is one of the fundamental purposes of education, which should be to create good, well-informed, adaptable citizens.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of how I'm probably saying the same thing.
Right.
That are both, that are well equipped to do two things: to participate fully as members of a community, but also to adapt and thrive in an ever-changing economy, right? And so I think I had a very classic kind of liberal arts education, and I've done a bunch of things that are fairly technical afterwards, despite not having that as a focus in my early education or even in college. And I would argue, I think there's a way to do this. I will say also, as an elected official, as a public servant, it's really stunning on any given day, when you interact with people, just how disconnected people are from civic processes, right? How kind of uninformed they are about our democracy and a bunch of things, and even as they're super well informed about stuff that I don't think is important, but like the Kardashians and other
Yeah.
and it's not because people aren't innately intelligent. It's because by virtue of their values or circumstance, people have become disconnected from these things. And so, if you just take civics as an example, there's a bunch of curricula within California that ostensibly teach civics, but apparently not well. If once people leave school, they forget it all.
Yes.
Right? Or probably more importantly, they don't engage in it.
Yeah. From my own personal experience, it's because we're getting away from those three things that I said earlier.
Yeah.
Right? Because when you think about civics class, that's like mandatory, right? So I'm saying you have to do this, right? And there's something interesting that I've seen with my students and it could be like the same activity, whatever it is, right? You're doing an experiment, you're doing whatever. If I come up to the students and I say, okay, today we're going to be doing this. Here's this experiment. Here's all the steps. Here's exactly what we're going to be doing. Go off and get started. As opposed to me coming in and saying, all right, I'm going to show you something, right? And I'll show them like either a live experiment or a video or something. And I'll posit a question to them like, what do you think is going on here? So one of my favorite labs that I like to do, because I was a chemistry teacher, was alien blood, right? So in the movie Alien, when the aliens get hurt, their blood is acidic, and then you can see the acid eating through all the metal and everything. So I would show them that video, and then I would show them a live demonstration of some alien blood that I created. And I put it in on some aluminum foil, and then they see that it eats right through it and everything. And they're always like, wow, that's so like, that's an actual thing, right? And I go like, yeah, so do you guys want to learn about this, right? And then I kind of take them through the lab, even though the lab itself is the same. They're doing the same thing.
Yeah, it's about context, right? I mean, it's about how you connected things.
You're right.
And I think that notion of holistic experience is really important, because otherwise everything gets kind of randomized and minimized over time.
Yeah. So like, that's my I guess argument is there ways of adding in that autonomy, right? Is there ways of when I wrote this, I had those three things in mind. I was like, all right, like when I say holistically, when I say they take the lead in their own lives, right? When I say that they contribute to society, that's all autonomy. And with civics, I feel like because it's always put in this context of like, you have to do this. And I saw this when I spoke to other teachers. A lot of teachers started to see the same thing once the A through G standards were put in, because the A through G standards were like, all right, these are the things that we have to do. And because earlier, when that first got started, that got tied into how we fund schools, right? Through testing and all that. I know we've gotten away from that, which is, I think, a very positive movement. They started to see like, oh, because we're like kind of enforcing these things and we're saying you have to do this, and it wasn't good enough for the students to be given a list of these are the things that you can do that are a part of A through G, and A through G is to get you into a UC or a Cal State. Right. Then it almost like took away that automaticity.
Yeah, I think that's true. I remember when I was a kid, my dad, when he'd catch me watching TV, would always like throw a book at me, like read this book. And the minute your dad throws a book at you and says, read this book, you don't want to read that book, right? Then it's like it's punishment. It's not learning. And you've made me think. I went to private school, as I mentioned, right? Which boarding school, and I'm sure it wasn't cheap. But one of the kind of cool things about it was the emphasis at my little school was on community service. We even had a Latin like motto that was non sibi sed cunctus, not for oneself but the whole, right?
Yeah.
And the way the school was organized, in addition to all the other kind of usual stuff, was virtually every function at the school that you'd have in like a little community like this was done by students. So the students had students ran the post office, students ran the school store, students ran
That's so cool.
the snack bar. The students ran the fire department, which thank goodness we never had a big fire. But you had to choose every year. You could choose kind of the things, the community service thing that you wanted to do, and it was largely autonomous, right? So the kids who ran the school store, they were responsible for making sure that everything was accounted for, and they ordered stuff, but it wasn't about, you're not going to learn about business. It was about, you're going to perform this function as part of this community, right? You have a relative role, and somebody else does the school bank, and somebody else, and it might have all been sort of make believe, but it was just real enough that I think it gave a context to living as part of this kind of weird little community.
Yeah.
And then I think for my part, I think it informed my inclination to do public service later. Because I felt like I was connected to this social whole, and I was aware that I had a role to play and an opportunity to contribute to it, to shape it.
Right. Yeah. I think that's very important. And I think that what you're highlighting here is that there's like this small scale thing that we can give to young people, right? That scales up with time, right? And I saw this also in Singapore, because the students are kind of required to spend like 1 day a week after school doing something to help the school, and it's their choice, right? So they could, go, work on the garden, or they could go clean up trash, or they could go clean up a classroom, or help out a teacher with a classroom. And it has that same role of, all right, we're going to civics shouldn't just be like what's in this book or what's in these set of standards. I think you're right that it may have to be like a lived experience, right? Where it's like, all right, let's see what we can do to make things better, right? And we'll do it in the context of each other and trying to help each other out.
Right, and so other systems, other cultures have a very sort of explicit sense of who you are, who we are, probably, right? What it means to be, Finnish or Singapore. I mean, you can sort of criticize it or critique it in some ways. Authoritarian system, but also very homogenous. But that makes a difference, right? As the way it informs smaller units, and then individuals within those units. And we don't really have that in our culture anymore, right? So everybody is kind of everybody's supposed to be. You're going to be the protagonist in the movie of your life, and we sort of we sort of tend toward that, to celebrate the individual, the outlier. As opposed to kind of the more mundane, there is value into being a member of a community. There is value to being aware of how we all connect to each other, and in that context, learning is a very different experience, I think.
Yeah, and so I think then because we're so multicultural, I feel like that's contributing. It's probably not the whole thing.
Sure.
Right. Because everybody's values are a little bit different, and everybody goes with my own, because I'm Hispanic, right? So my father's from El Salvador, my mom's from Mexico, and I got lucky in that my mom's grew up mostly here and saw the difference between the kids that went to college and the kids that didn't, and their outcomes. And she was like, all right, you guys, so long as you keep going to school, you guys have a place to live. Is what was taught in my home. But I know that a lot of the students that I taught, which were also minority students, I worked at a Title I school. I think we had over 93% of our students that were on assisted lunch, and most of them were Hispanic, Filipino, and they, and for the Mexican kids, I saw that they did not have that same mindset about education. There was this whole culture of well, I'm not here for a long time, I'm here for a good time. And I hated seeing it, because I'm like, I know what that turns into in the future.
Yeah. And that sort of emphasis on the now that we have in our culture. Yeah, and I actually had, I think the most valuable thing I got out of my military experience relates to that, which is, I came out of college and I became an officer, and then you're 22 and you get assigned responsibility over a unit.
Right.
And I had these kids. I was an artillery officer, artillery stuff, right? Who were part of my unit, and they were, to a person, well, let me go. You know, they were enlisted, which is to say they got to a point in their life, right, where coming out of high school, their options maybe weren't the same as mine, so they wind up being persuadable to join the U.S. Army. And what the military does really well is it does an amazing job at assessing people and then integrating people and then training them up to do things. So what you had were these kids who did bad in high school, but who it turns out actually had like really amazing talents, who in many cases I think were smarter than they themselves realized. And the insight I think I got from that was, you know, that talent, like sort of innate intelligence, is distributed pretty much horizontally, like universally. Opportunity is not, right? And it's the intersection of opportunity and talent that actually determines where somebody is going to go. And a lot of that has to do with your perception of what what's possible, what your opportunities are. And what we don't do very well in school anymore is actually, hone that to ensure that everybody, I mean, to your kind of mission statement, that everybody has a chance to find that thing that they're good at.
Yeah, that they're passionate.
And I always thought it was kind of ironic for, the military for having kind of a reputation as this kind of, total organization, is really good at actually finding what an individual is good at, and then is equally good at actually giving them, an investment in pursuing that.
Yeah. Wow. I've never really heard about, the military from that side.
Right. And again, like the insight was like, here I was, kid coming out of Yale. And I was always struck by like, wow, a lot of the guys in my unit were smarter, kind of more resourceful, more reliable than a lot of the kids I went to college with. The difference was the difference. The difference was where you came from, what opportunities were presented to you. And so if we could hope for anything out of our educational systems, it would be to do that better, right? To actually, allow people to find their talents and develop those talents better. Right. And part of doing that, I think, is rethinking how, we envision education, what its purpose is, and how people connect to it.
Yeah, yeah. So were there any, because when you're a part of a military unit, everybody has to be unified, right? To like a common goal or a common purpose.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, it's all geared around, well, a central mission, and then everybody has sort of a role to play within that. And so the military today is really technology focused. So what you have is people who learn sort of specific tasks, and then they're integrated into this large, very complex set of tasks that, that everybody does simultaneously to achieve an objective. But the stereotype of the military as conformist, right? Everybody has to be the same.
Yeah.
Not at all true, right? Not at all true. And again, like having done lots of things since, I've worked for big companies, small, big organizations, small, but I've never worked for an organization that took as good care of people, right? That sort of paid as much attention to people as the military. And it's sort of unsurprising when you think about it. Think about the sacrifices you're asking people to make. But it's also kind of ironic when you think about out in the world. Every organization should be able to do that, right?
Yeah.
Right. And we don't, at least not often.
Yeah. So how does, from your experience, how does the military build like cohesion while still maintaining we need to figure out what you're good at and how you can contribute, as at a personal level? So
within the military, obviously, you have a certain amount of, structure, right? And so, among other things, everybody dresses the same, everybody has a common bond, right? So, you could be anywhere in the world, you're in the U.S. military, meet another military person, you have something in common with that person. You have a shared, sort of relationship to this larger organization and its purpose. That is not true in society these days, right? And so one of the other interesting things I thought, from my experience, was here I was coming from relative privilege, right? Certainly educational privilege, to Fort Dix, New Jersey for basic training. And, day one, day two, first you're kind of shorn of all your clothes, you get a uniform. Then the next day they shaved all our heads, right? And I never knew how bad I looked, bald, right, until then. But you also realize you got all these kids coming from, the country, white kids from the country, black kids from the city. And there's this moment, well, there's two moments. One, on the bus there, you're kind of aware, like, we're all so different, like, this is going to be a weird experience. And then 3-4 days in, you have this moment where we're all exactly the same, right? And so for me, it was really disorienting because I had that question like, wow, was this a good idea, right? Like, I'm not sure, like, am I going to do okay? And it turned out I did all right. But for the kids who were coming from challenged places, they had a different experience where I think they got to reset, and they had this moment where like, wow, I'm on equal footing. I'm on a level playing field for the first time probably since elementary school. And that's where the training starts, right? They kind of level everything, and the people who excelled, were often like screw ups in high school, right? Screw ups in school, but they were given a chance, and they were given an environment in which they could kind of reset, not be judged, and then invest. And you have some wonderful success stories, through that.
Yeah. To what extent do they try to unify everyone under some common values?
Well, the values are, obvious, like, defending our way of life, et cetera. And then I think over time, as the military's gotten better at recruiting, there's a kind of a warrior culture thing that gets kind of articulated and imbued. And I'm not sure that's necessary, right? But it's about not so much values, but about community, about being a member, of an organization which is in a sense a community, and it's a community of soldiers, it's a community of people who are serving, and I think that becomes foundational, right? For you serve in the military, you go a bunch of different places. That never changes, irrespective of where you are in the world.
Yeah, I see it with my brother all the time.
Yeah.
Every time he comes across somebody else that was especially particularly in the Marine Corps, because he was in the Marine Corps, and he can spot them out of a crowd. Yeah, it's pretty interesting to see.
And you could be so different, but then it turns out you've had experiences that are absolutely the same, or certainly relatable. And if that were true for all Americans, right, we'd have far less friction, right? But it's not, right? Because we're a very kind of separated community or society these days.
Right. Yeah. So are there any efforts like on the policy side of trying to incentivize people to be more civic in that way, to participate more in their local communities, to I guess have those experiences that unify and make people more cohesive? Because there seems to be, like, with the advent of technology, people seem to be going like in these different directions, and like that's at least the perception. I think it might actually be like a small amount of people that are really loud on the internet that are kind of like really divided. Right. When I talk to people, like just regular people who aren't involved in any of that, it seems like we have a lot more in common than differences, and everybody seems to have they don't have like that vitriol, I guess, that's separating the country.
So if you're thinking about like what are the policies we could create, implement that would do those things, it gets tricky, right?
Yeah.
Because there's this tension between sort of honoring the rights and privileges of the individual, and then forcing some greater level of community or interaction, and so we're not very good at that. I mean, there's other countries, because they don't question it, where take military service, right? I mean, there's a bunch of countries like Israel, South Korea, others, where you're expected to serve a couple years as part of universal service, and there are arguably a bunch of really positive social consequences of that, right? Which get to what I think I've described, which is everybody gets mixed up. And then you do a common thing together, and then you kind of go off into the world, but you've made new connections. You've got a different sense of your relationship to people and to institutions, and then you have this commonality of experience with everybody. And we don't have that. And there's nothing wrong with celebrating diversity. In fact, it's awesome. Yeah. But we should also think about how do we create commonality? Right? How do we create real community that's lasting? And getting back to education, how do you do that through education?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, because I think from a policy perspective, you could. Okay, so here's part of the problem that I see of why people aren't more civic or participate more in their local governments. A lot of the time, they're just too tired, right? Work has changed for everybody with the advent of particularly cell phones and email, because before, we used to, in the 90s, we used to have, all right, we come in at 9, we get out at 5, and that was it for our work day. Right. But since email has become like pretty much universal everywhere, pervasive, you can get an email at any time, right? And a lot of people feel like this, and I see it with a lot of people that work in business or in industry that I'm related to or that are my friends, is that they're just constantly on their phones going like, oh, I got to check, I got to respond to this, I got to do this. So I feel like that's exhausting people to the point where like they just feel like they don't have enough time or space to participate civically or participate like, in things outside that would unify them with their local communities.
So I think that's kind of undeniably true. That's why that we see kind of attempts in places like Europe to legislate like when businesses can send you an email.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Which is like seems a little severe, but there's probably a case for it.
Yeah,
But,
yeah.
and I think it's also true that access to all this information, creates this kind of superficial layer where like we think we know everything going on, and that seems to justify not fully participating, but it's not enough, right? So like great example I think is like take Facebook, right? So you can look at Facebook. I could wonder like, how's my friend John doing, right? And I can look him up on Facebook, and I can learn kind of everything on the surface, like, oh, John's married, he's got a job, he's living somewhere, and then the impulse to connect with John, like it's gone, right?
Yeah,
like oh, know everything about John, right? And so then my phone will ring and it'll be John. I'm like, I'm too busy, I don't want to take a phone call. And so we've lost a lot of, through that, the connection, the energy that comes from connecting either individually or, as you said, like as a part of a community, because you just want to watch Netflix, right? Order something that gets delivered to your house,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And then it starts the next day. Meanwhile, the world has to be run by somebody, or by
right,
somebody's. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I think that's a good place to end it. I really appreciate your time. I think this was a really great conversation. I love picking your brain. I wasn't sure, how this was going to go, but I think it went really well.
Well, Steve, really enjoyed it, right? Really enjoyed it. So glad to do it again sometime.
Oh, great.
Yeah,
thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for listening to my interview with State Senator Josh Newman to gain insights in education experience and policy in California. I think the most important thing that I learned was the importance of civic duty, building cohesion to battle like modern divisiveness. And if you like the podcast, be sure to subscribe and share us on any social media platforms that you have. You can also email me at lessismore.education@skiff.com. That's skiff.com. You can find me on Instagram at lessismore.education, on Twitter at lessismoreeduc1. My website is lessismore.education. The YouTube link is going to be linked below. You can also support me through Patreon at patreon.com/lessismoreeducation. Or you can find my writing on Substack at lessismoreeducation.substack.com. Thank you very much.